Hey y'all, I'm Rev Mimi. I saw this tweet the other day where a woman found herself in a relationship issue. She was asking her friend whether or not she should stay in that relationship because she felt angry all the time. She felt sad all the time. And her friend gave her this advice. Her friend said, listen, you should stay in that relationship. You should stay there because it's probably just a rough patch. And so it got me to wondering, listen, I don't know who that girl was. I don't know the full story about the situation, but I do know that sometimes we can confuse rough patches with red flags. I don't know what she was going through, and I don't know the full details about what she was dealing with, but I do know that God has a very real distinction between a red flag, which is telling you to run, and a rough patch, which he's telling you to test, and he's telling you to make it through to the other side. The Bible tells us about a man named Gideon who was faced with a similar situation. God was calling him to do something that he simply did not want to do. He felt that he was ill-equipped, and he just didn't even know if it was God speaking to him in the first place. And so what Gideon did was he asked God to prove himself for a total of 3 times. The first was simply to show that God was God, that God was who God said he was. The second was to lay out a fleece and to ask God to make only the fleece wet and allow everything around it to be dry. But that still wasn't enough for Gideon. He asked him one more time to make a fleece completely dry and everything around it to be wet. And when God came through all 3 of those times, then Gideon moved. I want to remind us that it's okay to ask God for clarification. You can find yourself in a rough patch dealing with a lot of issues, and that's when you need to be finding yourself in front of God. That's when you need to go to God and ask God straight out, is this a test? Is this something that I'm supposed to get through? Or God, are you telling me to move? The fact of the matter is God's move is always connected to something better. And when God is giving you red flags, it's because he has something better for you. Don't stay where you are. Don't stay in that place if God is telling you to move, which is why it's so important to get before God, to get in God's presence and ask God for clarification. I know that sometimes it's hard to ask that question because we've already decided what it is that we want to do. We've already decided that we want to stay in a situation, in a job, in a friendship. We've already decided that we don't want to move. And so we're scared to ask God to make that decision for us because we know that we'll have to follow that direction. And we're not alone in that. Our friend, Jesus Christ, had a similar situation. He asked God to take his cup from him. Jesus did not want to go through the suffering that God was calling him to endure. And so Jesus said these words, "If not my will, your will be done." And he prayed that prayer so hard that his sweat turned into blood. Y'all, that is a deep prayer. So I understand that it can be hard to pray, but it's necessary. And Jesus died on the cross so that we could have strength to do what is necessary. So get before God, y'all. Ask God those deep questions and figure out what God is saying so that you can step into God's best.